gonna be okay, big guy.
The old freighter groaned every time Daniel touched it, as if it wanted him to leave. He ignored the sound. Groaning metal was normal on a wreck this old. He had salvaged 100 ships like it, and none of them had ever complained enough to stop him. His scanner blinked red near the cargo hold at the back of the ship. Heat. Not machine heat. Something alive. Daniel stopped walking. On a dead ship, drifting for who knew how long near Outpost Rill. Nothing alive should still be breathing. He checked the reading twice, thinking his old scanner was broken again. It wasn't. He moved slower now, one hand on the cutting torch at his belt, more out of habit than real fear. Most salvagers on Rill carried something sharp, just in case. The corridor ahead was dark except for his flashlight, and every step echoed against metal walls that had not felt footsteps in a long time. The cargo hold door was bent, torn open from the inside rather than the outside. That was strange. Whatever had broken it wanted out, not in. Daniel pushed the door wider and stepped through. At first, he thought it was a dead animal curled in the corner. Then it moved. It was small compared to what he had heard about its kind, but even small, it was bigger than a grown man crouched low. Its fur, dark and matted, covered a body built for strength, not comfort. Two eyes opened, yellow and wide, fixed on him the moment his light touched its face. It did not run. It did not attack. It only shook, pressed into the corner like it was trying to disappear into the wall. Daniel had heard the stories. Everyone on the outer stations had. This was a ferox cub, from a species so feared that most alien governments ordered any young one destroyed the moment it was found. Grown ferox were said to be nearly impossible to kill, strong enough to tear through reinforced doors, fast enough to outrun most predators built to catch them. A cub today became a monster in a few short years, according to every warning Daniel had ever been told. He should have turned around right then. Every rule of survival on Rill said so. Instead, he lowered his flashlight so it was not shining directly into the cub's eyes, and he crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, less of a threat. The cub growled, low and shaking, more frightened than angry. Daniel noticed the ribs showing through its fur, the way its legs trembled just from holding itself up. It had not eaten in a long time. Around it, in the wreckage, he could see the shapes of other bodies, smaller, already still. A litter. A mother. Whatever had killed this ship's crew, or whatever accident had left it drifting, had taken almost everything from this cub except its own life. Daniel had grown up fixing broken things. Engines nobody else wanted, ships too old to be worth the fuel to move them, machines everyone else called garbage. He had never been good at walking away from something that still had a little life left in it, even when logic told him to. He reached into his bag and pulled out a ration bar, breaking off a piece and setting it on the floor between them, then sliding back a step. The cub's eyes moved from his face to the food and back again, unsure, before hunger won. It snatched the piece fast, chewing with sharp teeth built for far bigger meals than a ration bar, watching Daniel the entire time like it expected him to take it back. He sat there a long while, feeding it small pieces, saying nothing important, just talking in a low, steady voice the way he might talk to a nervous engine before starting it up. The cub's growls slowly grew softer. Its shaking eased, just slightly. By the time Daniel's comm crackled with Warden ISS asking why his salvage run was taking so long, he already knew what he was going to do, even though he knew exactly how bad an idea it was. He wrapped the cub in an old thermal blanket from his kit, and though it snapped at him twice out of fear, it did not truly fight him. Maybe it was too weak. Maybe some small part of it understood he was not going to hurt it. Daniel carried it back through the broken ship, back to his shuttle, holding it the way he might hold a piece of machinery worth more trouble than it was worth to anyone sensible. Warden ISS met him at the landing bay, arms crossed, expression already unhappy before Daniel had even opened the shuttle door. "You brought back a what?" ISS said, staring at the shaking bundle in Daniel's arms. "A survivor," Daniel answered. ISS looked at the cub for a long moment, then back at Daniel, and said the words that would follow Daniel around Outpost Rill for a long time after. "That is not a survivor. That is a war waiting to grow up. Every enforcement crew in this sector has orders to kill things like that on sight. You are going to bring trouble here." Daniel did not answer right away. He looked down at the cub, still shivering, still watching him with wide, exhausted eyes, like it did not yet understand that it was safe, only that it had not been hurt yet. "Maybe I will," Daniel said finally. But it did not ask to be born something everyone is afraid of. Nobody gave it a choice. "I am not going to kill it just because of what it might become someday." ISS did not argue further, though the look on his face said clearly enough that he thought Daniel had lost his mind. He walked away, muttering about reports he would now have to write, leaving Daniel alone with the cub in the quiet of the landing bay. Daniel looked around at the scrap yard beside the bay, full of broken crates and old parts nobody wanted anymore. An idea was already forming, small and stubborn, the same way most of his best ideas usually did. The first cage Daniel built lasted less than an hour. He had welded together an old storage frame from spare metal sheets, thick bars, careful joints, the kind of cage strong enough to hold a mid-sized cargo drone without trouble. He thought it would be more than enough for a starving cub that could barely stand a day earlier. He was wrong. By the time he came back from grabbing tools, the cage was in pieces, bars bent outward like wet paper, and the cub was pressed into the farthest corner of his workshop, growling at the wreckage of its own doing, more scared of what it had broken than proud of breaking it. Daniel stood in the doorway a long moment, looking at the twisted metal, then at the cub shaking against the wall. "Okay," he said quietly. "Not a cage, then." He understood then what should have been obvious from the start. The cub was not destroying things out of anger. It was destroying things because being trapped terrified it more than being hungry, more than being hurt. Every instinct in its small body was telling it that closed doors meant danger, that being locked in a small space meant it could not run if something came for it, the way something clearly had come for its mother and its litter. Daniel needed something different. Not a cage. Something that felt like shelter instead of a trap. His eyes landed on an old cargo crate sitting in the corner of the salvage yard, one he had pulled from a wreck months ago and never found a use for. It was large, dented, rusted at the edges, but solid, built from thick metal meant to survive the worst conditions of deep space travel. Its main feature, the one that mattered most right now, was a wide door on one side that opened freely, not locked, not sealed, simply open. He spent the rest of that day and most of the night working on it. He cut the door wider, so it swung open easily and never had to be forced. He lined the inside with soft cloth from packing material, old blankets, anything that made the metal feel less cold and less like every other trap the cub had likely learned to fear. He left the crate sitting on its side in the corner of the workshop, door facing outward, nothing blocking the entrance, nothing stopping the cub from leaving whenever it wanted. Then he stepped back and waited. For a long time, the cub did not move. It watched Daniel from across the room, watched the crate, watched the open door like it expected a trick. Daniel busied himself with other work nearby, fixing small parts, keeping his hands moving, letting his presence become boring rather than threatening. Hours passed before the cub finally crept toward the crate, low to the ground, ears flat, ready to bolt at the smallest wrong sound. It sniffed the entrance, sniffed the soft cloth inside, and then, slowly, stepped through the open door. Daniel did not look up, did not react, did not make a single sound that might startle it. He simply kept working, letting the cub explore in peace. That night, for the first time since Daniel had found it, the cub slept without shaking. Word about the human raising a ferox cub spread across Outpost real faster than Daniel expected. By the following morning, curious faces were already gathering near his workshop, some out of simple curiosity, others with expressions closer to fear or open disapproval. An older trader, his scaled skin marked with the kind of scars that came from decades of dangerous work, stopped outside Daniel's shop and stared at the crate through the open door for a long moment. "You know what that thing grows into," the trader said, not unkindly, but plainly. "I know what people say it grows into," Daniel answered, not looking up from his work. "Same thing," the trader said. "Not always," Daniel replied. The trader shook his head and walked away without another word, the kind of silence that said more than an argument would have. Not everyone reacted so calmly. A group of station workers, refugees who had lost family to ferox rage generations ago, according to old stories passed down through their people, gathered near the workshop entrance that evening, voices raised, demanding Warden ISS do something before the cub grew large enough to be a real danger. Daniel listened to the noise outside his shop without opening the door, standing near the crate where the cub had curled itself into the soft cloth, ears twitching at every raised voice outside. He crouched beside the crate, keeping his voice low and even. "Nobody is coming in here tonight," he told it, unsure if it understood the words at all, or only the calm behind them. "You are safe in there. That is the whole point of it." The cub's eyes, still wary, still uncertain, watched him from inside the crate. It did not growl this time. It simply watched, and slowly, its breathing evened out, matching the steady rhythm of Daniel's voice. Outside, the noise eventually died down as Warden ISS came out to calm the crowd, promising he would look into it, buying Daniel more time than he probably should have. Inside the workshop, Daniel sat beside the crate long after the cub had fallen asleep, staring at the dented metal that had somehow, in a single day, become the safest place in the cub's entire short and painful life. He did not know yet how much trouble that small kindness would eventually bring to Outpost Rill. He only knew that for the first time in longer than he could remember, something had trusted him enough to fall asleep beside him, and he was not ready to lose that over what other people were afraid it might someday become. Old Rin did not visit Daniel's workshop by accident. He was an old trader, one of the few people on Outpost Rill who remembered a time before the station's scrap yards had grown so large, back when trade routes were smaller and everyone knew everyone else's business. His skin was pale gray, wrinkled with age, and his left arm ended just below the elbow, a permanent reminder of a job he no longer liked to talk about. Most people on Rill knew him only as a fair trader with strange, faraway eyes. Few knew he had once hunted ferox for a living. He found Daniel outside the workshop, sitting on an overturned crate, watching the cub chase a loose bolt across the floor with clumsy, half-grown paws, tripping over its own feet more than actually catching anything. "You should not have brought that thing here," Rin said, without any greeting first. Daniel did not look up right away. "Everyone keeps telling me that." "Because everyone is right," Rin answered, lowering himself carefully onto a nearby stool, joints creaking louder than the old metal beneath him. "I used to hunt them, you know. Young ones, mostly. Easier to find before they grow big enough to fight back properly." Daniel finally looked at him, surprised less by the confession and more by how calmly Rin said it, like discussing old weather instead of old killing. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked. "Because I want you to understand what is coming," Rin said. "There are groups whose entire purpose is finding ferox young before they mature. Not soldiers exactly. Enforcers, contracted by more than one government at once. If word of that cub reaches the wrong ears, and it likely already has, they will come here, and they will not ask you nicely to hand it over." The cub, hearing the tension in the voices even without understanding the words, stopped chasing the bolt and moved closer to Daniel instead, pressing itself against his leg the way it had started doing more often lately. Daniel rested a hand on its head, feeling it lean into the touch. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "That made you stop hunting them?" Rin was silent for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. "I killed a mother once, protecting her litter, exactly the way any creature protects its young. Afterward, I found the litter hiding nearby, too small to fight, too small to run properly. My employer wanted them dead too, said it was cleaner that way, no chance of one growing up angry about what happened to its family." Rin's eyes moved to the cub still pressed against Daniel's leg. "I did not finish that job," he said simply. "I have not hunted anything since." Daniel absorbed that in silence, understanding now why Rin had come here, why he had bothered explaining any of it at all. "You think I should give it up?" Daniel said finally. "I think you should be smart about how you protect it," Rin corrected. "Hiding a ferox cub in the open, in a scrap yard, where half the station has already seen it, is not protecting it. It is inviting trouble to your front door." "What do you suggest instead?" Daniel asked. Rin considered the question carefully. "Keep it quiet where you can. Teach it to listen, to hide when it needs to trust that crate of yours as a place enforcers might overlook if it comes to that. And be ready to explain yourself, because eventually, someone official is going to ask why a human on a trade station is raising something every government in this sector wants destroyed on sight." That evening, after Rin left, Daniel spent extra time with the cub, practicing something he had not thought to try before. He would say a single word, quiet, calm, and guide the cub gently toward the crate each time, rewarding it when it went inside on its own. It was slow work, full of missteps and small failures, but by the third night, the cub understood. When Daniel said the word, it retreated into the crate without hesitation, curling into the soft cloth, waiting there until he told it otherwise. Warden ISS visited twice that week, each time with new reports he did not want to share. Official inquiries were being made about unusual Ferox activity near Outpost Rill, inquiries that traced back to the wrecked ship Daniel had salvaged weeks earlier. ISS did not say the cub had to go, not directly, but the warning underneath his words was clear enough. "You are running out of time to decide what you actually want to do here," ISS told him one evening, standing near the workshop entrance while the cub watched him warily from beside the crate. "I already decided," Daniel answered. "I am not giving it up." "Then you had better hope old Ren's advice is good advice," ISS said, before leaving without waiting for a reply. Daniel sat beside the crate long after ISS left, watching the cub finally relax enough to fall asleep against his leg, its breathing slow and even, trusting him completely in a way that made the coming danger feel both entirely worth it and entirely terrifying at the same time. He did not know exactly when trouble would arrive. He only knew, with growing certainty, that it was coming, and that when it did, a crate and a single trained word were not going to be nearly enough protection on their own. The enforcement ship did not announce itself quietly. It dropped out of transit close enough to Outpost Rill that every ship docked nearby shook slightly from the wake of its arrival, sensors across the station lighting up all at once with warnings nobody on Rill had access codes to shut off quickly. Within minutes, the entire station knew something official and armed had just arrived. Daniel felt it too, a distant tremor through the workshop floor, and the cub, now nearly twice the size it had been when he first found it, flattened its ears and pressed itself instinctively toward the crate without needing to be told. Warden ISS reached the workshop before Daniel had even finished checking the station feeds himself, his expression tighter than Daniel had ever seen it. "They are here," ISS said. "Enforcement vessel, official markings, requesting full station cooperation regarding," and he paused only slightly, regarding unauthorized Ferox presence. Daniel felt his stomach tighten, though he tried not to let it show. "How long do we have?" "They are already docking," ISS answered. "Commander leading the group goes by Tavik. I have dealt with enforcement crews before. He will not waste time on pleasantries." Tavik arrived at the workshop less than an hour later, flanked by two armored escorts, his presence immediately filling the small space with a kind of cold authority that made even the station's usual noise feel distant and quiet. He was tall, built lean rather than heavy, with pale, sharp eyes that moved over the room, the crate, and finally Daniel, without a hint of hesitation. "You are the human harboring the Ferox," Tavik said. It was not a question. "I am the human who found a starving cub and did not leave it to die," Daniel answered evenly. Tavik's expression did not change. "Semantics do not matter here. What matters is that Ferox young, left to mature, become an unacceptable risk to every species in this sector. Galactic protocol is clear on this matter. The animal is to be surrendered immediately for termination." Behind Daniel, a low growl rose from the crate, the cub sensing the tension even without understanding a single word being exchanged. "It has not hurt anyone," Daniel said. "Not one person on this station." Yet, Tavik replied simply, "That is the entire problem with your argument. Ferox do not become dangerous gradually, in a way anyone can predict or control. They mature quickly and violently, and the only truly reliable method of preventing harm is to remove the risk before it exists." Daniel felt anger rising in his chest, though he kept his voice level. "That is not prevention. That is punishment for something it has not done and may never do." Tavik studied him for a long moment, something almost like curiosity flickering briefly across his otherwise unreadable expression. "You genuinely believe that?" he said, more observation than question. "I do," Daniel answered. "Then you are either remarkably foolish," Tavik said, "or remarkably stubborn. Either way, it changes nothing. I have my orders, and this station has agreed, at least on paper, to comply with sector enforcement protocols in exchange for continued trade access." Warden ISS shifted uncomfortably at that, clearly unhappy to be reminded of exactly that arrangement in front of Daniel. Daniel looked between Tavik and ISS, understanding now just how little room he actually had to maneuver. "I need time," he said finally. "Time will not change the outcome," Tavik answered. "It will only delay it." "Then delay it," Daniel said. "Give me until tomorrow. Let me at least say goodbye properly, if it truly comes to that." Tavik considered the request for a long moment, his sharp eyes flicking briefly toward the crate, where the cub's low growl had not stopped since he entered the room. "Until tomorrow," Tavik agreed eventually, though his tone made clear it was a courtesy, not a negotiation. "My crew will remain docked here in the meantime. I would advise against attempting anything foolish with that time, human." "I am not planning anything," Daniel said, which was, at that exact moment, entirely true. Tavik left as coldly as he had arrived, his escorts falling into step behind him without a word, leaving Daniel alone in the workshop with Warden ISS and the low, steady growl still coming from the crate. "I am sorry," ISS said quietly, once the enforcers were gone. "I did not know they would move this fast." Daniel did not answer right away. He walked slowly toward the crate, crouching down beside it, watching the cub's wide, wary eyes track his every movement from inside the soft cloth lining he had built weeks earlier. "You did not do anything wrong," Daniel finally said to ISS, though his eyes never left the cub. "This was always going to happen eventually. I just did not think it would happen this soon." "What are you going to do?" ISS asked. Daniel reached a hand slowly into the crate, resting it gently against the cub's shoulder, feeling the tension in its muscles slowly ease at his familiar touch, the growling finally fading into uneasy silence. "I do not know yet," Daniel admitted, "but I am not handing it over. Not tomorrow. Not ever, if I can help it." ISS said nothing more, only nodded once, grim and tired, before leaving Daniel alone with the cub and a single night to somehow figure out how to save something the entire galaxy had already decided did not deserve saving. Morning on Outpost Rill usually meant noise, distant engines starting, traders arguing over prices, the constant hum of the station's old systems keeping everyone alive. That day, the corridor outside Daniel's workshop was almost completely silent, and somehow that silence felt louder than any noise ever had. Daniel had not slept. He had spent most of the night sitting beside the crate, talking quietly to the cub, not about anything important, just steady words meant to keep it calm, the same way he had done since the very first day. The cub, sensing something wrong without understanding exactly what, had stayed close beside him the entire night, occasionally pressing its head against his hand, as if trying to comfort him in return. By the time footsteps finally echoed down the corridor outside, heavy and deliberate, Daniel was already standing, positioned directly between the open workshop door and the crate behind him. Commander Tavik entered first, his two armored escorts close behind, weapons visible but not yet raised. His sharp eyes swept the room once before settling on Daniel. "I trust you had your time to say goodbye," Tavik said. "I am not saying goodbye," Daniel answered. Tavik's expression tightened slightly, the first real sign of impatience Daniel had seen from him. "This does not need to become difficult, human. Step aside, and this ends quickly and without further complication." Behind Daniel, the cub let out a low, uncertain growl, sensing the danger clearly now, though it did not move from where it stood partially shielded by his body. "I am not stepping aside," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear building in his chest. Tavik's escorts shifted, weapons rising slightly higher, though Tavik himself raised a hand, holding them back for the moment. "You understand what happens if you continue to obstruct enforcement protocol," Tavik said. "This becomes a matter of station security, not simply animal control." "Then it becomes that," Daniel answered. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then, from the corridor behind Tavik's group, another voice broke the silence, old and rough, but steady. "That is enough," Rin said, stepping into the doorway, his single arm raised slightly as he moved past the escorts without waiting for permission. Tavik turned, clearly surprised by the interruption. "This does not concern you, traitor." "It concerns me more than you realize," Rin answered. "I hunted ferox for 20 years before I stopped. I know exactly what they are capable of, and exactly what makes them turn violent in the first place." "Then you understand precisely why protocol exists," Tavik said. Rin shook his head slowly. I understand that protocol exists because most people never bother learning the difference between a ferox raised in fear and one raised with trust. I have hunted the first kind. I have never once, in 20 years, encountered the second kind, because nobody ever bothered giving them the chance to grow up any differently. Tavik's jaw tightened, though he said nothing immediately. Rin continued, nodding toward the crate behind Daniel. That cub has had exactly one violent instinct since it arrived here, and it is hiding, not attacking. Ask yourself honestly, Commander, how many ferox you have ever encountered that chose to hide from danger rather than meet it head-on? The room fell silent again, tension hanging thick in the air. The cub, as if understanding it was somehow being discussed, pressed itself even further into the crate, small growls fading into something closer to frightened whimpers. Tavik studied the crate for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his sharp features. Protocol does not account for individual behavior, Tavik said finally, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. It accounts for risk at scale, across an entire species. Then protocol is wrong, Daniel said quietly. Or at least, it is not always right. You are asking me to kill something based entirely on what it might become, without giving it any chance to prove it could become something else instead. Tavik was silent for a long moment, his sharp eyes moving between Daniel, Rin, and the crate, clearly weighing something Daniel could not fully read. If I stand down, Tavik said eventually, and that animal ever harms a single person, on this station or elsewhere, the responsibility falls entirely on you. Not on protocol. Not on this station. On you alone. I understand, Daniel said immediately, without hesitation. Tavik studied him a moment longer, then turned to his escorts, lowering his hand slightly, a silent signal that made both of them finally lower their weapons fully. This is not forgiveness, Tavik said, turning back to Daniel. It is a delay, granted under my own authority, and one I can revoke at any time if circumstances change. I understand that too, Daniel said. Tavik gave one final, unreadable look toward the crate, where the cub's wide eyes were still watching everything unfold, before turning and walking out of the workshop without another word, his escorts following silently behind him. The moment the footsteps faded completely down the corridor, Daniel's legs nearly gave out from the sudden release of tension, and he sank down beside the crate, breathing hard, hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline finally began to fade. Rin stepped further into the workshop, lowering himself slowly onto the nearby stool, watching Daniel with something between exhaustion and quiet approval. That was reckless, Rin said. Probably, Daniel admitted. It was also the right thing to do, Rin added, after a moment. Inside the crate, the cub finally crept forward, pressing its head firmly against Daniel's shoulder, its earlier fear slowly melting into something calmer, something closer to relief, as if it somehow understood, in its own way, exactly how close it had come to losing everything, and exactly who had refused to let that happen. Months changed Outpost Rill more than anyone expected, though not in the way most people originally feared. The cub Daniel had once carried back to the station wrapped in a thermal blanket was no longer small enough to be carried at all. It stood taller than Daniel now, its frame filled out with lean, powerful muscle beneath dark fur that had lost its matted, starved appearance long ago. Anyone seeing it for the first time might reasonably feel the fear the galaxy had trained them to feel toward its kind. Anyone who had watched it grow up on Rill knew better. Daniel had started calling it Rust, half as a joke about the old crate it still refused to give up sleeping beside, and half because the name simply fit, steady and worn and stubbornly persistent, much like the crate itself. Word of the standoff with Commander Tavik had spread well beyond Outpost Rill, traveling faster and further than Daniel ever expected a small station argument to travel. Traders passing through told the story differently depending on who was telling it, some painting Daniel as reckless, others as brave, most somewhere uncertain in between. Regardless of the version, the core of the story remained the same everywhere it was told. A human had stood between a ferox cub and an entire enforcement crew, and the cub had not attacked a single person the entire time. That detail, more than anything else, was what slowly began changing minds. Old Rin visited the workshop often now, no longer simply out of concern, but out of something closer to genuine friendship. He would sit on his usual stool, watching Rust with the same sharp, assessing eyes he once used while hunting creatures like it, though the calculation behind those eyes had changed completely. "You know," Rin said one evening, watching Rust carefully nudge a piece of scrap metal toward Daniel like an offering. "In 20 years of hunting, I never once saw anything like this." "Like what?" Daniel asked, only half paying attention as he examined the scrap Rust had brought him. "That," Rin said, nodding toward Rust. "A ferox choosing trust over instinct. I always assumed it was not possible. I am beginning to think I was simply looking at the wrong examples." Warden ISS, though still cautious, had grudgingly stopped bringing up official complaints altogether, mostly because station traffic had noticeably increased since word of Rust had spread. Curious visitors, some scientists studying ferox behavior for the first time without violent intent, others simply travelers wanting to see the animal everyone was suddenly talking about, began stopping at Outpost Rill more frequently than the station had seen in years. Not everyone who visited came with good intentions. A handful of visitors arrived hoping to provoke Rust into aggressive behavior, either out of misplaced curiosity or lingering prejudice too old to disappear overnight. Each time, Rust responded the same way it always had toward anything that frightened or unsettled it, retreating toward Daniel or toward the familiar shelter of its crate, rather than lashing out. Commander Tavik returned to Outpost Rill exactly once more, several months after the standoff, though this time without armed escorts, and without the same cold certainty he had carried before. "I came to see for myself," Tavik admitted, standing at a careful but curious distance from where Rust lay sprawled lazily near the workshop entrance, watching him with wary but calm eyes. "See what exactly?" Daniel asked. "Whether protocol was actually wrong," Tavik said simply, "or whether you simply got lucky with one unusual animal." "And which do you think it is?" Daniel asked. Tavik studied Rust for a long, quiet moment before answering. "I think protocol assumes there is only ever one outcome possible for a species like this. I am no longer certain that assumption was ever entirely correct." He did not apologize exactly, and Daniel had not expected him to. But before leaving the station that day, Tavik paused briefly near the workshop entrance, glancing once more toward Rust and toward the old, dented crate still sitting proudly in the corner despite clearly being far too small now for its original occupant. "That crate," Tavik said, "is the reason it never became what everyone assumed it would." "Maybe," Daniel answered. "Or maybe it just needed one place in the entire galaxy where it never had to be afraid." Tavik said nothing further, only nodded once before finally leaving, his ship departing Outpost Rill quietly, without the same violent tremor that had accompanied his first arrival. That evening, as the station settled into its usual quiet noise, Daniel found himself once again sitting beside the old crate, now serving more as a favorite resting spot than any real shelter Rust actually needed anymore. Rust curled awkwardly around it regardless, far too large to fully fit inside, yet clearly unwilling to abandon it completely. Daniel ran a hand along the crate's dented, rusted surface, remembering the frightened, starving cub he had first carried out of a broken, drifting ship what felt like a lifetime ago. "You did not need much," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "Just one place that never asked you to be anything other than exactly what you already were." Rust shifted slightly, resting its heavy head against Daniel's shoulder, breathing slow and calm, entirely unafraid, in a galaxy that had once been so certain it never would be. Outside the workshop, Outpost Rill carried on as it always had, unaware, or perhaps simply no longer caring, that the quiet kindness of one stubborn human and one old, dented crate had managed to change, in some small but lasting way, exactly what the galaxy had always assumed to be true about fear, about danger, and about the difference between the two.